So this panel is going to get into something that I have personal experience with, and which I think is the kind of event that we'll be talking about, and events we'll be talking about, are the things that happen when you actually go after people with private power, sometimes called oligarchs, and what they do and what kind of counter-assault they can launch to stop people from reporting on them, from broadcasters from running stories about them, particularly about the origins of their wealth, or them in particular in any fashion. And in the investigative reporting program at Berkeley, in the seminar that we do, the standard seminar at the end of the semester, the last thing we do is we sue a couple of students and have them served with lawsuits based on their stories, and then schedule their depositions. And at a regular law firm, we did it at Kecker and Van Ness this year, and videotape it. Why? Because there's often nothing more frightening the first time you're sued. You know, myself individually, back in 1976, the first time I was sued, I was served on the street here in Berkeley with a lawsuit asking for $630 million in damages. And I didn't know what it meant. And if you haven't gone through the process, the first time around is usually frightening, enough to have what the courts have called the chilling effect. In this panel, where there'll be a discussion of putting a publication completely out of business, amongst other things. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this is particularly relevant because we now have the first president in the history of the United States who has been a plaintiff in a defamation suit. Even a defamation suit in which he knew, like many other oligarchs who sue, that the story, in fact, was true. So this kind of litigation, which often these days costs publications their libel insurance. Libel insurers don't like to start paying out bills, and so they have to go pay higher premiums and find a new insurance company. These kinds of lawsuits can and do affect what we learn and what we can do. I'm sure that Donald Trump learned from his attorney back in the 1980s, Roy Cohn, who was an expert at inflicting pain and denying that which was true, even his own HIV/AIDS, to the time that he died, that kind of tactic is something we're probably going to see more of in the coming years. I do want to point out that, ironically, the only time in this very hall, 2 years ago, Jim Chanos, who is a short seller in New York, sat on a panel where he was opining about the Chinese gambling capital of Macau and the origins of the fortunes of Sheldon Adelson and Steve Wynn. For that, he was sued for defamation in federal court here. That suit has now been thrown out for the third time, and but may even be ongoing beyond that. Why? To send a signal, a warning to people who want to talk about the origins of someone who is extremely wealthy, the origins of their wealth. So tonight's panel, which I just missed being in, this documentary, you can hear that story, but was inspired by a documentary called Nobody Speak. So you're going to see a few clips from the documentary, and you're going to see, and there'll be a discussion of the famous Gawker case, or infamous Gawker case, depending on which side you're on. Then the moderator of tonight's discussion knows exactly what it's like to be in the crosshairs of a billionaire over a story that was true. Mother Jones magazine, as you may remember, and Monika Bauerlein in particular were involved in this litigation for quite a long time. It cost them a lot of money. Ultimately, they prevailed. This year, they won the prestigious National Magazine Award, but in fact, they could have been put out of business had they not been able to successfully defend themselves. So with that, I want to ask Monika to come up and moderate the panel and take us into this discussion. Oh, I just wanted to point out, for the record, we invited Peter Thiel, who was involved in the funding of the Gawker suit. We never got a coherent reply from his office. We did reach his attorney, Mr. Harder, and he was kind enough to reply by email saying he couldn't make it because he'd be in New York today. And then when I asked him if he could come in by Skype, he said unfortunately he had theater tickets tonight. So we tried. And we didn't thought about inviting Ann Coulter.
Because she needs a venue. Thanks, Lowell, and thanks everybody for taking time out from the important business of drinking and, eating the best food at any journalism conference. The four of us actually thought quite a bit about how to make this panel as riveting as you have a right to expect 2 glasses of wine into the evening. And our first plan was to just bring Farenthold back up here and have him sit on the table and tell war stories for an hour. But he has some minor obligations to take care of, having to do with picking up his White House Correspondents' Award. And so our plan B is to keep you on the edge of your seat in fear, terror, and, major level freak out. Because we'll be talking about threats to journalism and journalists. And I'd say this panel starts from the hypothesis that we do live in a new threat environment. And we'll try to engage in a spirited discussion with you. We'll talk a little bit among the panel, but then really throw it open to you pretty quickly. And we want to talk about what are the threats that our profession confronts now that are different than what we have dealt with in the past. Which ones should we freak out about? Which ones can we safely put aside for a little while? And how do we confront and engage them? All that in under an hour. So these gentlemen really require no introduction in a room full of journalists, but I'll exercise moderator's privilege and go on at great length about them anyway. Brian Knappenberger right here is a documentary filmmaker, has made some amazing films that you need to put in your Netflix queue right away, including one about Aaron Swartz, the digital transparency pioneer, had a whole documentary investigative series called Truth and Power, and has wrapped up just now a documentary around threats to journalism and journalists, focusing primarily on Peter Thiel and the Gawker case, as well as the saga of Sheldon Adelson and the Las Vegas Review-Journal, which anybody who's been coming to this symposium is familiar with. We've had John Smith here, and that Peter Chanos episode that Lowell just made reference to. So you'll be able to catch up on all of it when the film premieres on June 23rd.
June 23rd, yeah.
On Netflix.
On Netflix, right.
So bookmark it in your queue. David McCraw is the Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times, a hero to a hero to the Times newsroom for many years, but a folk hero of American journalism as of last fall when he wrote this amazing letter in response to a letter from Donald Trump's lawyer responding to a demand that the Times take down an investigation of multiple allegations of sexual harassment and sexual assault against Donald Trump. David is a humble guy, and he said, oh, you don't need to go back to that, tonight. We have lots of other stuff to talk about, but it is such eye candy for people like this room that I just felt the need to throw it up again. And Steve Engelberg, who is the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, a man who has had his hands in more Pulitzers than I think he can keep track of, has worked in every major investigative unit in our business, and had a hand in another episode of investigative reporting virality not long ago when Sean Spicer referred to ProPublica as a left-wing blog. And ProPublica took to Twitter with an extensive threat, sharing some facts with the press secretary. And the internet went nuts about it. So We'll start, Brian, with you maybe, and with a little teaser from the film. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this part?
Yes, this is one of the very bizarre things about this trial is that so much of it was secret while it was happening. So it was revealed later, obviously, that Peter Thiel was funding Hulk Hogan's lawsuit, and after this kind of staggering $140 million verdict. But at the time, they didn't know this. So this clip is about when things are starting to seem off. So they started to get kind of clues that all was not right here, or all was not as it seemed.
Every time I watch this, it brings back this, sense of dread that I remember from the litigation that Mother Jones and I personally were involved in when our legal, at the hands of another Republican billionaire, when our legal team, a couple of whom might be in the room here, would keep telling us there's something weird about this case. We haven't seen this before. This, it's being litigated into the ground at every stage of discovery. Everything is turning into motions. Everything is being briefed. And it seems as if the goal here is something other than to set the record straight according to them or extract damages. And so, Brian, I'm wondering, in all the work that went into making the film, if you came out feeling like there was something beyond Gawker and the specifics of that case that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think this in particular is an example of what Lowell was talking about in the introduction. That it doesn't matter really the merits of the case, the kind of the relentless sort of everything you just described, weighing on the costs of a news organization can have an incredible, very powerful effect. Your question is bigger. I do think there's a lot to learn with Gawker. I was initially started this film. I actually wanted to make a film about Peter Thiel originally, and then I was captivated by this Gawker-Hogan case and the kind of big issues that seemed to be at stake: privacy versus the First Amendment. But with this kind of staggering $140 million verdict and the revelation that Peter Thiel was behind it, I thought it became about something very much bigger than Gawker. And so, and at the time, that's when I jumped in. I didn't quite know where this was heading at first. But at the time, we were already in the middle of this insane presidential election. And you just couldn't separate what was happening here from that larger context. Here we are in Florida, important political state, contested county, Pinellas County, hometown to Hulk Hogan. Here are these media people come marching in from New York. You had a palpable, even in some of the comments that were made in the courtroom, a hatred of the media. And I was talking to John Cook, who you see there saying the creeping dread line. I was talking to him last week, and he said when he heard the verdict, the $140 million verdict, he turned to his executive editor at the time, a woman, and she said her immediate reaction was, Trump's going to win. I didn't have it in quite that lightning bolt kind of moment, but I felt that through the whole summer. This very seriously thought that Trump could win, and that this kind of hatred of the media, that this case was reflecting that in some way. So I do think there's lots to talk about in terms of Gawker and what Gawker did and the specifics of the case, but the way that the money was leveraged in secret and the way that echoed what's happening in other ways, and the Las Vegas Review-Journal story, I think pointed at something very much bigger than what was happening in this simmering courtroom in Florida.
So let's toss that to David, because you told us ahead of this conversation that if you want to watch me dissemble, ask me if Gawker was a big deal. And we love nothing more than to watch a lawyer dissemble.
After 2 glasses of wine, what could be better, right? 3 in some cases.
So go to town.
Well,
and
for,
I would love to hear. I would love to have you both unpack that a little bit,
okay.
and also tell us if there's something about Gawker that maybe was a BFD.
Okay, and you know, Brian, I saw some of that clip that since this is all devoted to rights, the right of lawyers to stay in expensive hotels. I can't believe you took them on that. That's, really, where's the loyalty? Anyway, so, you know, to me, the Gawker case is a perfect storm. I mean, you have all these factors that come together and make a disaster, because that ultimately becomes a disaster. You know, nobody should be driven out of business for what they publish. But you had a crappy insurance policy by Gawker. You had terrible witnesses. You had an awful judge, a runaway jury. You had private secret funding. And you had snarky content, which was at the base of this. You know, thing that a lot of people in large swaths of America would think, like, why are you running a sex tape, especially if it has Hulk Hogan in it? And so it's, I grew up in Illinois, and every once in a while we'd have a tornado, and it was fascinating, and it's worth studying, and it's worth remembering. But I also remember the advice from my Republican banker father, which was rotate the tires on the car and have good insurance. And that's really forget the tire part, that's just for your private use. But the insurance piece becomes really, really significant here, because Gawker had a crappy, crappy insurance policy. If they would have had a decent insurance policy, here's what the story would have been. Gawker wins on appeal. Peter Thiel is exposed as having made the single worst investment of his life, okay? The appellate court, there were at least 7 motions that went from the trial court to the appellate court, all of them won by Gawker, okay? That appellate court, I'm almost certain, and I'm now channeling Floyd Abrams as well, would almost certainly have overturned that verdict. But to get there, you had to have insurance. To get there, you had to weather that storm, and they couldn't do that for the reasons that Brian's film has pointed out. And that would have created a very, very different narrative. So to me, it's important in the sense that I think part of it is a great story, what characters and so forth, and you have a judge that should really be the subject of a lot of close scrutiny in some of the rulings she made and on all that. But at the end of the day, it didn't really change the law. And I think the reporting that was done on the Peter Thiel financing afterward was really, really important, because we don't see that yet being repeated, and if it were, that would be a very dangerous precedent.
Do you see the nature of that? What do you think is the nature of that precedent? Is it about the existence of a class of people who can undertake this litigation for, you know, the price of what for you and me would be a nice pair of shoes?
Sure, I will. Sorry. So if you, one of the things that happens with the private funding, when you have this kind of secret private funding like this and unlimited funding, is that it completely distorts the dynamics of the case, because in a case like, and I was talking to some of the Gawker attorneys the other night, you know, one of the things that would happen in a case like this would be settlement. But to settle, you have to have motivation to do so. And if it ain't your money and it's limitless, you're never going to do that. You're never going to sit down and talk about settlement.
I am so tempted to abuse moderator's privilege and ask, you know, lots more questions about insurance, because I think that's,
a
whole
I'm a lawyer.
separate...
I would love that. I so love that.
And, you know, this is something that, you know, I've had the privilege of having to think a lot about, but we'll leave that for another panel. That's, you know, this access to insurance, especially for some of the smaller news organizations, is a big topic. But right now, I think what maybe we'll do is pivot to a slightly less depressing part of this story and play another clip from the film. So why don't you roll that, and then we have a question.
You want me to set it
Steve.
up, or do you want to? No.
Yeah, why don't you set it up for a sec, Brian?
Can I pause it? So this is, I really love this group of reporters. This is the beginning of the Las Vegas Review-Journal story. So we tell a story about that. I believe they were a panel about that last year. John Smith was here last year. So this is when they hear that their paper has been bought, and they don't quite know what's going to happen yet, and there's a kind of sense of resolve that comes over them. Thanks.
So I love how they figured out that this is not a newspaper executive because he was not well dressed enough. Leaving that aside, it's an amazing sort of rah-rah story of, reporters and editors doing what reporters and editors do. But Steve, we were talking a little bit about what comes after that. When you're sort of past the to the barricades moment and in the day-to-day and in the kind of ongoing repercussions of an experience like that, or an experience like the litigation that a lot of people have gone through, and what that can mean for the journalism that you see later on.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say, as I'm sure all of you felt, watching that, you kind of get the chills, don't you? I mean, that feels like a real-life scene out of Spotlight as they're recounting this, and it was absolutely fantastic. I think the problem that we face in the industry is, first of all, not every newsroom has people of that level of courage, which was extraordinary. Not every newsroom has a David McCraw who can get the, quote, piece of ass into a lawyer's letter. I mean, that is an accomplishment. So for those places that maybe people worry, as people do, about, say, paying their mortgage, I bumped into a reporter we've been working with at ProPublica from the Norfolk Virginian Pilot, where I started my career as a newspaper reporter. And I said to him, I was the union president in Norfolk in 1982, and I said, I'd only been there like 9 months when they elected me, and I said, why am I qualified? And they said, well, you've got no kids, no mortgage, you're expendable. But let's imagine a newsroom where that isn't true and that people have kids and mortgages and so on. I think the thing to worry about a little bit in this environment is not the direct threat, but rather the sort of indirect effect on the minds and psyches of the people who work in these newsrooms. The truth of the matter is, though we would like to tell people that, there's some kind of strict, ethical, mathematical algorithm that brings us to our decision points, it's a very subjective business. You can do a story, you cannot do a story. The world is full of good stories. We mentioned earlier on that Trump had sued a reporter because he didn't like the fact that the reporter had written a book in which the reporter alleged that Trump was not as rich as he had been saying, and so Tim O'Brien was sued. Well, Tim O'Brien used to work for me at the New York Times in the investigative unit, and at one point he and I and the team were engaged in a pursuit of a bunch of Russians. I'd never done a Russian story before, and it got really, and this is the late 90s, extraordinarily nasty. I mean, to the point where, my reporter was in the midst of a divorce, and, they tried to entice him with women and made phony web postings. It's actually, when you think about it, actually kind of ahead of their time. And I remember thinking about 2/3 of the way into that story, Jesus, is this really worth it? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, I mean, as a newspaper reporter and editor, you have these considerations, you have these thoughts, and I'd like to think that we're all going to be as brave as the folks in the Las Vegas Review. I really would love to think that. I'm not sure that's always going to be the case, and I think therefore some of these developments and what we're seeing right now are potentially quite worrisome.
And we'd love to hear from any of you when we go to questions who have been through experiences like that, and like to hear what kinds of lingering effects it left. And I think we would all be not entirely honest with ourselves if we claimed that it has none. I want to ask you guys one more question, and then, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people here who have thoughts. And that is, assuming that we do face a different kind of threat environment right now, that includes a lot of the risks that we've dealt with in the past, but also some new or escalating ones. What's the one that you would pick as the most immediate concern that we confront, and bonus points if you have an idea for how to address it?
Well, I don't have an idea how to address it, but I will say from an earlier conversation that some of us were at, listening to what happened to Tom Brennan is a reminder that at this point in history, I think the sort of most direct and easy way to get at the press is actually to dox and attack and troll the reporters who, don't have a ton of defenses against an army of bots and trolls and the rest of it. And I actually, my thought right now is that we are less likely, at least, I think I'll double check this when I get back, but I think we have good insurance. Dick Toffel is a belt, suspenders, and, guy. Our general counsel and president is an extremely careful person, so I suspect our insurance is excellent. So I don't think that's something that's going to happen tomorrow. But what if we write a story that really annoys God knows who? We have a reporter right now, A.C. Thompson, who lives out here covering, documenting hate. So he writes a story that really annoys some people who are doing in the hate business. And they start doing this kind of stuff that was described by Tom Brennan and Warhorse. I mean, I'm not sure what you do about that. And that is a kind of I think is a serious a thing that is going to keep happening, because I think it's easy, and I think the people who do it get away with it.
I think that despite all the noise coming out of the White House, and still buy a T-shirt, that the real threat is in leak investigations. For 45 years, for more than 45 years, the law has been very, very weak, and it was reinforced in Jim Risen's case just how weak the law is in protecting reporters from having to reveal sources. And the only thing that has really kept it from being a disaster for the industry is the restraint of the Department of Justice. And I don't think that Jeff Sessions really plays the restraint game.
Sherry, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, these guys are in the trenches. I just think about this in a very sort of big picture way. That obviously we're light years away from a time in which there were 3 major news networks, and we have a very different kind of where there's a healthy kind of local news press, competing papers on a local level, lots of different actors now. Lots of different kinds of actors with social media and other things, leaks, people like WikiLeaks and all that. So we're just in a very new environment now. I think traditional investigative journalism has lost a lot of its funding, and so it's being pummeled by a president and sort of attacked in all sorts of ways, and it's in a vulnerable state, not yet being born into what it's going to be. So I think it's a very critical time for this to stand up for those organizations that are doing it right, and give them our money, encourage people to support them, and when they get in trouble, and otherwise, and also just stand up for the Fourth Estate.
Buy that T-shirt and wear it, is what he's saying. Okay. So if there are any of you who have questions, now is an excellent time to unburden yourself of them. There are folks with microphones, and I know you have thoughts. And some of you have experience as well. You know who you are. While we wait for people to get their thoughts together, David, an interesting thing that you said was that the types of letters that you get demanding that the Times not do things that it does have changed. Tell us about that.
Well, I think that it has become very easy for the lawyer letter to now drop in the words either fake news or George Soros conspiracy,
I thought that was only us.
And I think to some extent, and this goes to a point that Steve was making, was what's the effect on people, and the experience of the New York Times, I think probably the experience of most national publications and broadcasters has been that libel hasn't really changed, that the libel litigation that's brought is inevitably brought by minor characters deep in stories, not by public figures, not by public officials, not by anybody who is famous. But I think that all the noise created by the Trump administration has made people concerned that it's actually those people who might sue. So part of it is just reminding folks that we still need to look out The real serious libel risk comes from minor players. One of the things that I think, and if I could sound, I know that this is not the place to sound hopeful, but I'm going to sound a hopeful note, which is that I actually think that you guys are winning. You know, I mean, that one of the things whenever I was being interviewed in the beginning of the Trump administration was, what are you telling your reporters? And what I was saying, keep calm and carry on. I later learned from NPR that slogan from World War II by the British government was deeply offensive to people in England, because that's what they already were doing. They didn't need their government to. So my reporters don't need me to tell them that. That's what they're doing. And I think if you look at the stories that are being done, the kind of stories, the depth, the investigative reporting, it's really hard. You're getting the crap kicked out of you, your credibility is being questioned, but the stories are still coming. At some point, the traction's going to be there.
You know, actually, Monika, while we're waiting for questions, I'll ask you one. Because I raised this point about chilling effect, and yet, you know, as you were sort of at Mother Jones finishing this thing off, you guys did dive into sending an employee into the Corrections Corporation of America's maw. So were you guys at all worried about sort of litigation risk, legal posture? How did you sort of parse that? Because obviously it was a brilliant decision, it was the right thing to do, and you did it. Was it any different, you know, having been in the midst of that litigation process, or not?
It was different in that we had a much more acute sense of what we might be dealing with if litigation were to ensue. And not only did we go into the CCA story, but at the night that we were out with our lawyers toasting the summary judgment that threw out the case, the Vandersloot case, you know, about 2 glasses of champagne into the evening, we said, oh, and by the way, in, you know, about a month, we're going to drop a big story on Sheldon Adelson, and we'd like you guys to take a look at it next week. And they spat out their champagne. And, but we got through that. So, you know, that's, but in a way, I hate to say this, but it's almost easier to do at Mother Jones, because that's our DNA. You know, if we don't do that, if we don't walk into those maws, you know, we can pack up and go home. So now my job is to just, you know, look in the mirror when we do something like that and say, is it worth staking everything that we've got on this? And I think you raised a really important point about the doxing. Is it worth staking the safety of our people on this? And what do we do to keep the physical and psychological risk to our people down?
Can I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
The
I'm not on the
Idaho
panel,
billionaire. No, you should be. The Idaho billionaire that sued you. Didn't he say that he was going to put up money for anybody else who might? Any other takers here that might want to sue Mother Jones? Wasn't there an offer?
He did. He said he was, you know, going to offer up $1 million for people harmed by the press, who might not have the resources to sue. And haven't heard a peep, but you never know.
Right.
Question right here.
Yeah, you mentioned the leak investigation, Mr. McCraw. Mostly those, I think almost all of them have been national security related in the last 2 administrations. Could and would you expect to see that expanded beyond national security to more common kinds of stories, and how big a danger do you see that by the Justice Department?
I think national security remains the really dangerous element, because I think it's hard for judges, when presented with a subpoena on a reporter, not to buy into the Justice Department's point of view, which is the reporter knows who talked to her. Okay, you know, there's an intuitiveness about that. A lot of times in criminal cases, the reporter is going to have done a lot of research, but is not going to have witnessed the crime, which is the case in a leak investigation. This conversation with the reporter is the crime under investigation. So I do think that there will not be real restraint. I think there may be better defenses that judges will buy in routine criminal cases.
Do you see, you know, you mentioned the Department of Justice. Do you see Congress trying to go down this road?
I hold no hope of Congress passing a federal shield law. There was a time when there was some momentum for that, and it broke down over several things, including the arrival of WikiLeaks, which gave pause to members of Congress, the trouble of defining who's a journalist for purposes of the statute, and that debate bogs it down as well. In the end, it sort of shattered, and I just don't think there will ever be that consensus in this Congress. One of the leading lights, as you will remember, in favor of a federal shield law was Congressman Mike Pence. I think that man has left the House in every possible sense of that term.
I was actually thinking, that was fascinating. I was thinking the other way, should we anticipate reporters being hauled before congressional committees?
Anything can happen, as I think somebody's already said, but that one's not a top worry yet.
Okay. Everybody hear that? Why was the Obama Holder Justice Department so aggressive in going after journalists, i.e. Jim Risen?
It wasn't just Jim Risen, first of all,
yeah.
at all.
Well, interestingly enough, as far as reporters, it was.
Yeah.
What the Obama administration was very aggressive about was going after leakers. And in all of those leak investigations, with the exception of Risen, which was a holdover case from the Bush administration, it was very rare, in my case, non-existent for the Justice Department to ever even reach out to us and suggest that the reporter should be involved. But going after a leaker, well, it's better in the sense that we're not in the mayhem of having to answer a subpoena and everything that's involved with that. At the end of the day, it gets to the same result, right? That if leakers are scared, the public loses.
One of you's got a microphone up there, I think.
Hey, I'm Roddy Boyd, Southern Investigative Reporting Foundation. Small nonprofit, does financial fraud reporting. We've been dropped by 3 insurance companies over the last 5 years, and each time they stipulate complaint letters. I guess I guess the legal term is retention letters, where they demand they might sue us for libel or libel pro se and retain your records, and we have to disclose that to our insurance companies, and they then, drop us on December 31st with 30 days written notice. And I was wondering if you guys are seeing anything along those lines. I mean, obviously, no one can muscle the New York Times or ProPublica like you can muscle us, but I was wondering, are you seeing that? Are you seeing those trends more broadly put within the journalism world?
Brian, did you ever have a conversation with them about their insurance, about why it came down to that one claim?
Yeah, the infliction of bodily harm, as opposed to, obviously wasn't libel or anything else. I think that was also a choice on the part of the Teal lawyers, not to, this wasn't libel. This was a strategic choice on their part.
Yeah.
And I think my impression was that the insurance companies were looking for an excuse not to do it.
That would be the insurance companies. Gary, are you going to shed light on insurance?
No insurance. I'm going to break my own rule. I always hate it when they hand somebody a microphone and he doesn't ask a question. But I do want to point out something and build on something that Brian said and the other two talked about. Vandersloot lawyers in the Vandersloot case in Idaho are the lawyers for the people, the dean who won against Rolling Stone. Yeah. Now, how does a dean afford that plaintiff's case? I'm simply saying that because this is a room full of investigative reporters. And there does seem to be a certain parallel there. And you mentioning that Vandersloot did threaten and say, after it had all been wrapped up, he claimed victory and then said, I'm giving $1 million for anybody who is in a situation like we are, like the dean from Virginia, perhaps.
Sounds like a story.
Well, at the very least, it tells us that, Peter Thiel was not the only one who had that idea, and Peter Thiel and Frank Vandersloot will not probably be the last. Question up here.
Yes, Stephen, you brought up several times the issue of doxing, and While I have corporate counsel to deal with the litigation threat, and in criminal justice have learned to deal with keeping a private identity when I'm reporting on people like the Aryan Brotherhood, in covering political issues, I have never been doxxed quite so heavily in my life. And how do you help your reporters through that, especially reporters who don't want to be, media rock stars and would prefer that lower profile?
Well, it's a fair question. I think, unfortunately, the answer I would give to our reporters is similar to the ones I heard earlier in this conference. I think there are moments where you tell people, turn off your internet, put your phone down, don't look at this crap. I think there is that. But I think we also, on some level, are going to have to accept the notion that if you want to be a journalist and you want to play in this league, that this is one of the risks that you take. I hate to say that, and I hope I'm wrong. But I think, again, at the moment, the environment here is that it is so easy to do, and though there are aspects of it that are criminal, it is so seldom actually prosecuted, that I think the kind of people who do this do it with impunity. And I think we are going to have to accept in the world of journalism that a percentage of people who write tough stories on politicians that certain groups, have these kind of deep feelings about, you'll get threats. And that will have an effect, I suspect, on the number of people willing to do these stories. I hope it doesn't have a serious effect, but I'm sure people will think about it, and I'm sure some people will decide maybe this isn't for me. I wish I could be more encouraging.
Yeah, one of our reporters became the subject of this and lived in Chicago and was having people being sent to her house through fake Craigslist advertising and all that kind of stuff. And she called the Chicago police, which was kind of the heads-up move, right? They then leaked the fact that she'd called the police to a right-wing blog.
Wow.
I think it was, last fall that, people started to really warm to the idea that this might not always be limited to digital threats. So that's maybe something to think more about. There's lots more questions. I think Sharon has one back here. Or who else? Okay.
I'm Dave Marish. I have a radio show and podcast. The Review Journal story had many wonderfully buffoonish qualities to it.
Why, thank you.
But it also crossed the reddest of red lines of journalism. Sheldon Adelson hid his ownership of the Review Journal for half a year. He had a corporate beard, the hedge funders at Gatehouse, but editorial decisions that occurred during their alleged management of the paper were only in the interest of Sheldon Adelson. And Adelson, for several days, persisted in denying that he was the owner of the paper. We're in the accountability business. If you can't be held accountable through anonymity, you have breached the whole credibility of the industry. To the degree that none of the institutions of American journalism, not the American Society of Newspaper Editors, not individually or collectively the great journalism schools in America, specifically denounced this incredible offense at the heart of the credibility of journalism, anonymous ownership, was really a terrible, terrible moment, I think, for our industry and our profession. And to a degree, Shelley got away with it. And I think this is something that we should all think about and can never let happen again. There can never be anonymous ownership of a journalistic enterprise.
Did he get away with it, panel?
Well, over 100 reporters quit from the paper. I think they're, talking with them and eating with them, it's clear that the coverage has changed of the Las Vegas Review Journal. Lots of things that are Sheldon Adelson or Steve Wynn related stories that are critical aren't appearing, and there's been a lot of that. There's a big football stadium being built there. Lots of that reporting just didn't happen. So, yeah, I think he had a huge effect on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, unfortunately, if you kind of net the thing out, his first preferred position was to anonymously influence what the readers of Las Vegas received. He failed in that regard, but I think David is very cogent in arguing that in the long run, he took off the table a institution that had been a thorn in his side and his business's side for a good long time. So I would tend to agree. I think he got away with it.
Sorry, I have the microphone. It felt weird if I asked a question. I'm wondering, like, as a younger journalist and as seeing the industry change with more freelancers and more contracts and more fellowships, how are newspapers kind of working to protect freelancers or contract journalists, particularly with the issue of trolling and threats and things like that? Like, how can a freelancer feel comfortable embarking into this world of investigative journalism?
That's a good question.
I mean, I will say where we sit at ProPublica, and I think this would probably be true at the Times, the arrangement of payment and the level of protection we offer are two very different things. We have actually had, we are currently defending an idiotic lawsuit, I'm sorry. Lawyers who own a nursing home have sued us, which is a bad thing. If you're going to go after a nursing home, try to find one that doesn't owned by lawyers, so they're getting their legal service for free. And they're suing us, and it's quite specious, but it was 3 journalism students who wrote the story, and we are defending that, and we're defending them. A couple of them, I think, were sued individually as well as suing ProPublica. So, I mean, I think my perspective is, if somebody writes a story for you, your responsibility to them, whether they're a freelancer, a contract employee, or a full-time employee, is identical.
Right. Yeah, and Steve is right. We're probably not going to be representative of the industry, but we have defended a freelancer who, if you can believe this, managed to prompt a libel suit for a phone call he made for a story he never wrote. Okay. He called somebody in his reporting and left a message which seemed to suggest that the subject that he was writing about had cheated his business partners out of money and was looking for comment. We felt we had an obligation, even though we never got a story, and even though as a freelancer, defend that. But I don't think that the industry has done really well across the board on these things. And I recently was at a gathering of foreign correspondents, freelance foreign correspondents, and the thing that I heard there that very disturbing about being thrown into war zones by publications and websites without any protection. It's really quite sobering. But one of the things that they kept reminding each other about was ask the question. If you're going to go someplace dangerous, if you're going to do a story that has legal risk to it, ask up front. Are you going to be there for me? And then, of course, because I'm a lawyer, will you put it in writing?
Well, I think you can also look at, I mean, we live in a world that's, where the way we communicate is changing quite a bit. And the vulnerability of that communication in terms of surveillance and protecting sources and all, and this may even go back to the question about doxing and revealing, the sources, the sort of threatening. I mean, what we were talking about is a threat model. What is a threat model? What sorts of stories are you working on? What kinds of things should you be worried about? And along with that goes, how are you communicating? How are you going with sources? How are you, what protections are you taking? What are you worried about? So maybe a broader conversation about that in the industry as technology changes.
So do we have time to do one more?
One more question.
All right. If none of you jumps up, well, there you are.
David, you're talking about the risks and perhaps enhanced risks under the new administration of reporters, journalists having to respond to subpoenas about confidential sources. And of course, there is one thing that's
and in the national security area in particular. There's one thing that's certainly more frightening and worse than having to respond to a subpoena, and that's having to respond to an indictment. It's not something that's been a great threat over the last sort of quarter century or so, but as the lawyers in the room know, the Supreme Court has never actually said that journalists can't be prosecuted, and on the contrary, in the Pentagon Papers case, there's a footnote and a plurality opinion that says, well, we can't enjoin you from publication in advance. There's nothing to stop the government, the Justice Department, from prosecuting you after the fact. Now, since then, there have been other Supreme Court decisions that would cast some doubt on that, and the issue is sort of up in the air. And what has prevented, as you mentioned, what has sort of kept the journalists relatively free of that kind of harassment is more Justice Department policy and convention and history and tradition than case law or statutory limitations. But how do you gauge the risks, and where would you rate the probability that that line could be crossed by this Justice Department? And I do think that is one of the great red lines for journalism.
Yeah, and this is the 100th anniversary of the Espionage Act for all of you looking for yet another thing to celebrate. And it would be a hell of a way to mark that anniversary by doing what has never happened in that 100 years, and that is to prosecute a journalist. That would be an outrage. I think you will see these issues creep up on us if, in fact, as we expect, there will be an indictment in the WikiLeaks case. And Jeff Sessions had said, hard to read what his answer really meant in front of Congress, but he seemed to do a carve-out if he thought a journalist was working for a foreign power. And that's where I think the slippery slope will be, that this attempt to create this idea that maybe Julian Assange was a state actor or a non-state actor at war with the United States. Scary possibility.
Okay, with that scary possibility, we'll bring the proceedings today to a close. Tomorrow you can have coffee and pastries here if you get here at 10 o'clock, and the session will start at 11. Have a good night.